importance? How do you really incorporate your blackness into the products that you do? I want to start with Micheline.
Oh man, pressure.
I know, right?
Um, when I was a kid growing up, I used to tag along with my brother. We lived in Flatbush, and we would go to because they used to sell comic books in the candy store,
Hmm.
and I would get things like Wendy the Witch and Richie Rich and things like that. And at the time, I didn't notice it. I was just glad to get comics, but after a while, many years later, I was like, wow, there's no adventures with anyone who looks like me or any other black people or any black people who are portrayed in a way that is anything other than completely distasteful and kind of racist.
Hmm.
I wasn't really into superhero comics, so I didn't really see a whole lot of that. But it instilled in me an urge to want to create the kinds of things that I wanted to see. So, um, magic, adventures, the same kind of adventures I see other kinds of characters who happen to be white having, that live in regular households and are just kind of relatable in terms of their everydayness. And I also wanted to use that platform to kind of speak to issues that bothered me, um, Karenism, police brutality,
Hmm.
racism, and things like this.
Outstanding. Jason, same question, because I'm always 133 Art Publishing is just beautifully done company, and you actually have a character that's not just black but also gay as well. How have you been able to incorporate your blackness into, and what's the importance, and how do you feel about this character Stronghold being received so well?
Um, oh man, Stronghold being received is awesome. It wasn't a stretch to create a character like that and to create a black character like that. We were trying to we were trying to bring, those qualities into a comic book in a way that we hadn't seen before and bring him on his own adventure and not do it in a way, usually in mainstream comics it's this big to do, this character's gay, this character's LGBTQ, like that. And I was
Hmm.
like, I don't want to do that. We don't want to just make it a sideshow, or we don't want to just make it a selling point that this character is LGBTQ. We just wanted him to be. And same thing with sprinkling like black culture inside of like superhero comics, which is mostly what I do. Um I just want the character, I just want it to seem like this is people who actually exist, aside from the fact that they can fly. Um, so putting a lot of myself in the Stronghold, putting a lot of Greg Anderson Elise, who's the writer, into Stronghold is the way we do that. Normal occurrences, fantastic occurrences, but how would a black person react in these circumstances? And I think the supporting cast and the environment around that character is black, or a black person existing in those spaces. Like Stronghold specifically comes from Louisiana, the deep south parts of Louisiana, where he grew up in a white, well-to-do family, but he and his twin sister are mixed. Their dad had some infidelity, and there's a lot of contention in this family, but these two kids are the black children in that particular family, and that happens a lot. I've witnessed it myself. And to put them in those real circumstances and have them exist as black people, um is the mission, you know so yeah.
That's awesome. Regine?
Um, Similar to Micheline's experience, when I first started collecting comic books, most of the comic books that I collected had a majority, white presence in it. And it affected me in the sense that I love writing, I love creating, but it wasn't until I got older that I realized, like, when I was creating my first like characters specifically that were comic book characters when I was younger, they were all white. And I never thought
Hmm.
anything about it until, your frontal lobe grows in and you're like, wait,
Hmm.
like it all of a sudden hits. Truly, that's exactly what happened. And so once I realized that, especially when I started officially like writing and publishing comic books, uh, I sought to change it. And since then, for me, my main concentration is bringing in the humanity of a character, um, especially black characters, but all the characters I work with, but black characters in particular, women, female characters in particular, because that often gets away from a lot of books. At least that's what I've noticed, that the humanity is missing. Like you see a character as a figure, they represent something, they represent beauty, they represent sexuality, all those things that are aesthetic, but what makes that person a person? What makes them a human being? And it's, for me, it's very important to incorporate that,
Hmm.
um, as opposed to just, again, just having the aesthetic. It's very important for me to articulate who a character is, what their motivations are, where they're from. It's, it's great to look at these gorgeous characters, but it's more important for me as a reader and as a writer to add those nuances. And so once I saw that some of that was missing, or in some cases a lot of it was missing, that just became sort of my mission. It's like, I'm a person, I'm a human being, and these characters are fantastical, but but if we are representing them as people, they should have these characteristics that are thoughtful and relatable.
And that's very true because too often they're like they're not people, they're props. They're
Yeah,
something to further the story instead of making them part of the story. It's more of diversity of being able to see them, but not inclusion of them actually being a part of the story. And that's a great
exactly.
point. TJ, how has your blackness been able to really how was you showing your blackness in stories as well and in your comics?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think ultimately it kind of brings me back to like, really what Regine said in terms of being at the comic book store as a young person, looking around and not really seeing any type of diverse characters that were written by diverse creators. I think my mother being a very big proponent of the arts and saying, "Hey, we want you to read these books and watch these movies with people of color and read these types of story. I mean, read these types of stories." We were always kind of looking for that stuff, but I guess I didn't really start to understand the dynamic and the landscape until I got a little bit older, like maybe in my early teens, like 12, 13, 14. Start to realize like, wait a minute, there's nobody that I can really relate to in comic books. I'm saying, this medium that I've started to grow to love. Because first I was like a Looney Tunes kid, and I was like Justice League, Superman, Batman. I'm like, wait a minute, well, like there's Black Lightning all the way in the background. He's just standing there. He ain't doing anything more than that, but he's the only
Hmm.
person that I can physically relate to. So when a comic like Spawn came out, I was like, oh snap, like there's one character I can finally start to, really get into and wrap my mind around. But all my other characters I liked before were like Silver Surfer or maybe a Wolverine, somebody who kind of wore a mask that you didn't really know exactly what they were as much, but were just dynamic. So I'm like, I'd love to tell stories about characters that are dynamic. And then I start getting into anime. And then I just start to like realize as I'm drawing and becoming more adept as an artist, I'm drawing all of my characters black because that's just what I know. So like my first Goku is like he's black and he's got a fro, you know what I'm saying? Like any of my first characters, they just start looking more like me and more like the people I know. So it's like it just felt natural, I think, for me to draw from the experiences, the people I grew up with, and the people that I knew um, as a young person into my teens, into high school, into college. So those are the stories that resonate most with me. And I think it's always interesting to see, you know, Black creators make characters that are white and that's all they make. I've always been kind of interested by that. Like, but why do you, maybe you're creating stuff for this market, or maybe you just you don't see yourself in these characters, who knows? But for me, it was very, very clear, like these are the types of stories that resonate with me, these experiences and the people that look like us. And I think it's just natural. We should be telling our stories, and just draw from our experiences like wholeheartedly.
That's very true. Now you brought up a great point about Spawn. Was Spawn the character, like the comic book character that got you more into comics and wanting to create?
Yeah, that particular, he was like the gateway that kind of like blew everything up, because
Hmm.
it was like that type of art, that type of creativity. Like, okay, this dude who wrote the story, owns the character. It was written off of his boy Al Simmons, his black roommate in college. Like these types of things were very interesting to me because it seemed very homegrown. It was less about corporations at the time. So yeah, I don't know. I just it kind of got me started into like anime and all these other different types of things. And then I start, finding out about comics like Purge and Brother Man, and I'm like, yo, there's this whole thing here that was there, that was just, kind of, I don't know, like it's just getting ready to pop like in a really, really big way. And then Shadowhawk was one of my favorites too. Like everything about the '90s kind of brought me into where I am today. You know what I'm saying? Like it was a whole movement.
Yeah, 90s was a movement about like yeah, being more of the creator owned stuff you said more, and also a lot of pockets and pouches on everything. So Jason, I'd love to know like what was the character that the comic book character that got you more into creating and stuff like that. What was the character that hit you?
Oh man, I'm an X-Men kid. I'm
Okay.
X-Men all day, every day. Storm, you know what I'm saying?
All right now.
Gambit, you know what I'm saying? Wolverine, not so much Professor X.
Uh,
Cyclops. Um
the shade. All right, cool. Okay.
no, X-Men is what drew me in. The first comic I ever read was an X-Men classic. My
Mm,
homeboy, he was like a couple years older than us, and he had like all these X-Men classics. And he was like, "Yo, check this out." And I'm like, "What? You can read like superhero stories and not and collect them?" Because before I've always been a superhero dude, but it was cartoons, so you never knew when you
okay.
were gonna see whatever episode of whatever you liked, again back in the day.
Mm-hmm.
So I was really like inspired because you can have these and you can reference them whenever you want. You can put your hands on them. So that blew my mind. And because I was already drawing, I was like, man, I would love to do this as a job. And that's kind of really what got me into comics. So X-Men is my gig, but to what TJ was saying, the 90s, man, when Image blew up. I mean, I was in one of those lines back in the day when the Seven were touring around the country, and like Jim Lee signed all my books. I mean, I had like 50 books with me, and Jim Lee signed every book, right? Like they were superstars, and the idea that they own these things really drew me in to say, man, this is something you can do and you can really be successful at it. I mean, seeing Liefeld on jeans commercials with Spike Lee and you know Arsenio Hall and
Hanging out
all
with
of that
Easy E.
right, like those things were really and I didn't know it at the time that it was like the business of comics, but the business of comics was drawing me in. Like it felt like a real thing you could do, and it felt like, oh wait, you can get rich. I mean, you can't, but still, it felt good. So the '90s and the X-Men drew me into comics.
That's awesome. Micheline, how about you?
Uh, when I was a kid, my father used to go on these like business trips abroad, and he would bring back French comics, which I couldn't really understand at the time, but it was all about the visual narrative, and that was when I was first realizing like if that is tight enough, you don't necessarily need to, that just the visuals can kind of show you what's going on, and so that's what I paid a lot of attention to. Um, when I was in the 90s, I got this job as a colorist for Milestone, and I found out that they were looking for people, and I was working I was working behind a cash register at the Guggenheim gift shop in Soho, which is now the Prada store. And I was like, wow. So I quit my job on the spot, which I don't recommend. And I put together this portfolio with my Power Mac 120. And I went in there and I got in there and I thought like I made it, which, was totally not what I did, but that's just kind of how it felt, being able to like take the pages and painting them. But at the same time, Image was blowing up at that time. Um, you know, I would go into the stores and I would see, you know, get a copy of Pitt, and I'd be like, you know, I'm a betrayer, and I'd stick it in, you know. Um, and people, there were also people who kind of were give us the business sometime, because they'd be like, oh,